What's up?
Well, after some technical issues and scheduling things, we are here having a conversation. Um, so I know I've gotten to listen to you have a whole lot of discussions with a lot of people, and I know I sent you one kind of a thing that was sort of one conceptual way that I was thinking of how some sort of a universalist thing might work. Um, because I'm not just all gung ho on it like that. But
Was that having to do with the possibilities and so on?
yeah, somewhat, yeah.
I have to admit that the time that you sent that to me, it was just wasn't a good time because everything was up in the air from the move. Just to some degree, things still are.
Hmm.
But I know that you and I had an interesting kind of discussion on it briefly
Yeah.
in your Discord messages. And I recall you're saying something that on your view, only a limited number of possibilities exist, as
Hmm.
if God only fashioned a limited number, raising the very interesting question, out of what materia prima or deeper understanding or notion of possibility did he fashion the possibilities themselves? Um, like that was a very interesting direction in which you took that because I think most people for whatever reason have some sort of modal intuition that there simply are infinite possibilities.
Hmm.
Whether or not all those are equally real,
Yeah.
I incline toward no on that. Just as Saul Kripke criticized David Lewis' position that all possible worlds are real, by saying if all possible worlds were real, what would God do to make one of them actual? Give it a kiss? So, in other words, understanding the way in which terms are defined on their complement, and one can't even meaningfully speak of actuality or possibility without presupposing the meaningful possibility of the latter. Possibility has to be possible, actuality has to be possible. Um, and so anyway, those are just some kind of thoughts that I have on that stuff right off the bat. I hear it a lot these days, modal realism and multiverse and many worlds and blah blah blah. It seems to me a basic sort of uh, truism that if some worlds are, then others aren't, because otherwise we can't speak of either. That's a little bit like Wittgensteinian, though, maybe. I don't know. I'm not a
Hmm.
real philosopher. I'm just an amateur.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had thought of this kind of more or less in the sense of, okay, first of all, I think we have to assume like this world is real, or for all intents and purposes. Like if you're totally convinced, like kind of the simulation theory, that's just not or to whatever extent that affects you, like this is the realest thing we know, the life that we have and our experience in this world. um but I think if we look at things always from like a strict chronological point of view, as if in before God created anything, there was just God. And then one day he decided to create everything. And then, everything just progressed along the path that it progresses. Then you kind of have all of these bad arguments that, atheists and people will criticize of the Bible of like, oh, why did God have to like wipe out the world out with a flood? Like he made a mistake, like why, if he's so great, like why does he make mistakes? And,
Or, I
these,
mean, there's also the interesting conceptual difficulty of speaking of the moment that time was created.
yeah.
One might say God is outside of time and he existed for that reason before time. I mean, maybe, but that's presupposing a deeper kind of underlying we call time.
Hmm.
So that's very interesting too. I think that a lot of the way that people talk about God and his eternity as transcending time all too often simply smuggles in notions of linear time.
Hmm.
Um, and rather than having eternity transcend linear time, really they almost envision linear time as transcending eternity because it's like in the beginning there was eternity and then there was this. And you've got the linear time that's somehow bigger than both, that's underlying both. And I think that's tremendously self-contradictory and difficult.
Yeah. Well, I think, that we always have to be aware of the fact that, like, chronological time is the way that we can perceive and understand things, but we have these hints that that is not necessarily the way time is. When we get into these concepts of God and his eternal nature, and he knowing the end before the beginning and things like that. And so my kind of basic idea, and I was thinking about this because I've been involved in a lot of creative processes and things like that. And my thought is, God has in mind something that he wants to create. It's not necessarily this world. What it is the new heavens and the new earth, and that's his ultimate vision of what he desires to create. But in desiring to create that, there has to be a way that you get from not having that to having that. I'm not saying that that's how it happens for God. I mean, but I guess use like a metaphor or analogy. If you, for instance, encounter some new object, like you pick up a phone or something, and this is the first time you've ever seen it, and you say, like, how did this get here? Like, right now in the moment you have the phone, but you have to think back of like how this phone could have been created, its material creation, the process, of the development of all the software and all these things, hours and hours and centuries of knowledge basically are distilled into this physical object. And and along that way there was a lot of trial and error. So from the point of it already being made, you could construct like one linear path of progress where all of the necessary steps to create that object were done without any mistakes or side trails or anything like that. But that's not actually how it was made. It was made through lots of trial and error and lots of random, kind of seemingly random, different paths. And this was also my way of thinking of this is like, so I spent a lot of time building furniture and things like that. And if you have an idea of like, oh, I want to build a table, and then you have to conceive of how you want it to be constructed. And Jordan Peterson talks about this, how like, the process of thinking is like, you're basically are in a way exploring like other possible worlds. You're considering different paths you could take, and out of hand you just kind of eliminate a bunch of them. So this is where I was thinking, most of these multiverse models, they have like these super absurd worlds where like everybody's like a pancake or something, or just everything's made of paint, or just bizarre, weird things. And that's kind of these little images that people imagine and they paint a picture of to show as a representation of this idea that every possible thing that could ever happen exists somewhere in some universe. But I think that God, being creative, really he has one end in mind, and he only imagines the paths that actually will result in that goal. Or he obviously, God can imagine all these weird, absurd things, but I think he just dismisses it out of hand because there's no use to him.
So I would agree with you that God has a goal and an intention in mind. And I would even go as far as to suggest that God's consciousness involves a kind of time. It's not subject to anything outside him. His consciousness is self-relativized, one may even guess, in rather the same way that yours and mine are. But the movement of God's mind bears description as a kind of divine time. And I would even tend to think that, because I'm actually kind of big on process. and sort of what you were saying earlier, I took down some notes to respond, but I would agree with sort of the singularity of God's creative vision. But I would ask, does not its being gain its definition from all those things that are excluded? One could not meaningfully speak of its being without speaking of all the things, or without understanding that in its place could have stood many other things, but it is displacing those possibilities, and that is what it means for it to be. That now and later exists in a kind of dynamic tension. Actuality and possibility exist in a kind of dynamic tension. And that what holds them together is this kind of welter, is the present moment as such, that you it seems to have some duration, but you can't measure it against anything other than itself, because once you measure it, you're measuring it as what it isn't, namely the past. The present moment is tremendously difficult to conceptualize. It has a reflexive, always sort of, it's like soap slipping, always slipping out of your hands. You can't grasp it. If change is real, when does it happen? You can't pinpoint the time when it happens, and yet change seems to be the only reality. But it's real as this kind of ever-present impossibility. You know, Parmenides used to trip on that. It's like, how is it that how is it that change can happen at all? For what is, and what is not, is not. You can never get beyond this thought. Well, I think that somehow reality, ultimate reality, is a self-resolving paradox that gets beyond that. Um, so it's tremendously difficult stuff, you know? I mean, I would agree with you. Like if something comes into being, something exists, it's like there has to be a process. And because everything is related to everything else. And so there's necessity of a process, like a derivation, or like a relationship that it has to everything else. That's why the very interesting, well, to me, very interesting philosopher, to other people, just cancel him, shut him up, and you're evil for even talking about him or looking at him, guy, Christopher Langan, he doesn't speak of aseity, or he does from a certain perspective, the perspective of something outside ultimate reality, which is definitionally impossible, because there's no reality outside ultimate reality. But to the extent one could speak of it, yes, that ultimate reality is ase, it's of itself. But inside itself, it's not that. It's self-created, which is tremendously interesting. Okay, so look at it like this: if you have like causal linearity, it's like, and deterministic, it's like classical theism wants to say that God created the universe, but he didn't have to. Yet the universe was necessitated by something. What necessitated it? Some creative intention. Fair enough. Was the intention necessary? You know, just a necessary part of God's nature, the specific intention to create this world? Because if so, then this world is as necessary as that intention, and is ipso facto as necessary as God. So we keep playing the game and deferring it, but if ever it's linear, it's going to be determinism all the way down if it's determinism anywhere. Does that make sense? The alternative is it has to be a loop. There has to be, if there's any contingency in the system, it immediately means a self-creative loop, the whole of which is necessary because it gains a kind of internal necessity from itself. Perspectively within it, there is contingency. I don't know how much sense that begins to make, but Lang speaks of a sort of self-relativized, self-creating God, who sort of created himself through a kind of like anthropic principle. Christ is like part of that, one might imagine. That in other words, what, you know, humanity required like the divine or cosmic mind to come into being, but then that being in its way also, or that cosmic mind or the cosmos or the universe, it like, because for Langan, the universe is God, but not just the physical universe, it's the real universe. It's self-contained. It's like the self-containing set of all sets.
Mm.
You know, everything real, the universe understood as everything real, is part of itself. The way that something can contain itself is itself a whole other deal. But I think he sort of appeals to the mereology of consciousness, which crucially always has two dimensions. You have like your state dimension and your syntax dimension. You have your space dimension and your time dimension. You have your information dimension, your cognition dimension, basically. And that's how something can be self-containing and not just be like this static circle. Oh, can the circle that contains all circles contain itself? No, because it's a flat two-dimensional circle. He gets around it like with a reflexive consciousness. But the idea is that somehow, just as the whole needs the part, and just as the part needs the whole also like needed the part. And so there's some kind of anthropic self-generating loop in here. I don't understand his thought because I'm not smart enough, but it's something like this.
Yeah.
And that would get to the idea of how God has an original humanity, just as humanity has an original kind of divinity. But obviously, this is very unorthodox speculation.
Mm. I mean, when it gets to that like point, it is kind of too much for me to handle. It's interesting because I'm talking to Jacob Federucci a lot, and he kind of talks about the Jewish conception that God is the Irenic God, so everything that exists is within God, which at that point it's hard to distinguish that from some sort of a simulation theory without something like the incarnation. Because
for Langen, God is a self-simulation, because you can say it's a simulation all day, all you want. Arguably, what's going on in here is a simulation. The question is, what's simulating the simulation? For Langen, base reality it's somehow self-simulating. It's like the MC Escher hands that are each one is drawing the other. For him, it has to be like that. And the essentially simulative nature of reality is because it's representational through and through. Langen is a kind of idealist, and so am I. The idea that for something to be is for it to be perceived, and for something that is non-perceptual to have being, no one can even explain what that means. The being of an entirely wholly non-perceptual thing. Kant offered the idea of the noumenon, which Langen dismisses as an inconceivable concept. Whatever Kant meant by it, we don't know, because he can't explain it. He couldn't possibly. Yeah, it's again, if we're gonna import ideas from someone who, according to other people, should be canceled and never mentioned, then ultimate reality bears description as a self-simulation.
Well, I was going to say the next thing. So there's a philosopher that somebody on our little corner turned me on to. His name's Roy Clauser, and he's been trying to work out like a Christian view, a purely Christian view of philosophy that doesn't rely on, like Aristotle or Plato or some other kind of model before that. I'm gonna go play for a little bit.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, buddy. No, stop. Forward.
Okay, buddy, go on. So I have dog and child right here. But he actually says that it was in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and actually the Dutch Calvinist tradition through a guy named Herman Dooyeweerd that came up. These are the two Christian schools of thought that came to some sort of a non-reductionist philosophy. But part of that is that ultimately God is unknowable except through what he chooses to reveal to us. And so anything that we can basically think that we can discover it's never God's ultimate nature, because we are able to perceive it and discover it to some extent. It's just a way in which he's chosen to reveal himself to us.
That's good enough for me.
Well, I mean, I think that is very helpful in a way, because it gets
we have a young philosopher discoursing on the nature of possibility and actuality, the relationship between epistemology and ontology. But she's being censored and canceled, unfortunately. And so if anyone in the comment section could, raise their voices in protest, that would be a good thing. Freedom of speech and all that.
So anyway, I mean, to me, that whole concept just of whatever the ultimate thing is, we can't know. That works for me because I can't live in that reality. I think that, while I enjoy the philosophical discussions to a certain extent, I think that it can be a sort of a trap in some ways, where once you get into these unanswerable questions, what are you doing with your life? I think, I'm a down to earth kind of person. I think what we do is very important. And while, I think, when Jesus tells us that we should love God with all our mind, the intellect is very important and we should be stretching ourselves. But when you get to these sort of, you got to figure out whatever the questions you can handle and maybe work at that level, and, leave some of these other things up to the greater minds, I guess. Or
there's a beautiful question which is ostensibly put by Jesus in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Toward the end, I think Jesus is said to ask, "How does this being, which is, inhabit this nothingness?" Which I love that question because it's totally what it is. It's what Parmenides was tripping on. It's sort of what I was talking about. Like, if change is real, when does it happen? Ultimate reality is like holographic or fractal, which means that everything that is partakes of its name, is entirely to itself. It is all there is. It is devised. And so this ultimate reality that you and I inhabit, that you and I are, in a certain sense, describe it exhaustively is to write on water. Whatever you say will, by the very fact of your having said it, will become untrue. It's like to predict it is to alter its outcome, and to observe it is to change it, that kind of thing. Which, interestingly, is why I suspect some of the Bible prophecies are not true. And some of the prophecies that people are given in near-death experiences are also not true. But that's a kind of heretical, neither here nor there, kind of an open theist kind of thing, but not really. Kind of, I explained it as God, the present future is known to God, but the future is not, because it does not exist as this kind of static thing that can be known or not known. But so that's a whole tail off. That's a whole digression. But yeah, is it unknowable? Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, what the hell is it? It's just what is it? What is his name? Ibn Arabi, whoever, the Wahdat al-Wujud, which is the mystical unity of being. If you try to close your mind in on it and define it, it's not going to be what it is. Si comprendes non es Deus. That if you comprehend it, then it's not God. So
yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of everything we do in a way is working in models. And I kind of been thinking about, and I did a little video. I didn't get to really write it out. It was just kind of my thoughts, but kind of this idea of there's a symbolism of tents in the Bible, and like what a tent is it's a temporary structure because you need something for now, but it points to a future because it's by design not permanent. And that's kind of like, I thought that God first dwells with people in a tent in the tabernacle, and then in the New Testament, when Paul is out founding churches, he's supplanting his preaching by working as a tent maker, which is mostly just used as, this describes bivocational ministry. But I think there is something to that nature of a tent, in that, and I'm I would say, I'm far and away Protestant, in the sense that as a Protestant, I feel like I can draw from any tradition, and they're all good and valid in that they worked for a time and a place, and they can change and adapt and work for times and places. But when you try to turn a tent into a temple, then it loses some of the utility of being able to work for people in a particular, in many times and places. So I kind of think of that as a way of just whatever we're doing here, we're always dealing in models and in analogies and metaphors, but it helps us to figure out how to do what we're supposed to be doing while we're here.
Well, that's I think, I mean, I find no fault in this, man. I can't find any fault in what you just said. At the beginning, you mentioned how you could see some kind of support for universalism from some sort of modal realist. Well, no, not even quite, but that essay on the imagination and possibility that you read, and which I did try to listen to, but I tell you, my attention span is very limited at the best of times. And because I really have a rather severe form of ADHD, as well as a sleep wakefulness disorder, which caused me to just space the hell out for like long periods, which I just call that vegetating. Something like what I imagine dementia to be. And I will absolutely just lose my thought in mid-thought. But I was wondering, what did you think? Because universalism, universal salvation, and whether one can assert that within Orthodox Christianity is pretty much an obsession of mine. It has been for 2 years. So I'm wondering what you think of that, if you have any thoughts on that. Oh, hey,
Sorry,
Michael, I can't hear you.
my mic was muted. I muted it on my end. So the constraints that I've been mostly working under for myself are typical kind of Orthodox Christian thinking in a lot of ways. I mean, I had grown up in a Reformed congregational background, so pretty much Calvinist, although my dad distinguished with some, he would consider others to be hyper Calvinists that were very focused on, the 5 points and things like that. But then I spent a lot of time working in a free will church, a Pentecostal church that had more of the free will type theology. And within those both, to me, I wrestling with that, have landed on the Calvinist side, more or less. I'll say I'm Calvin-ish. Nothing is,
I want to commend you for that, because I think that the real debate, soteriologically and eschatologically, is between Calvinism and Universalism, because Arminianism posits, I mean, if you look at it logically, the way that Thomas Talbot does, so this is not a theological designation as much as a logical one. There's a triangle, there's a trichotomy. God is willing that all shall be saved, but not able unilaterally to effect that. That's Arminianism. Logically, I know they're say, oh, Arminianism, this specific thing is like, I'm not just saying any, for our purposes, let's call Arminian any position that says God is willing that all shall be saved. He's just not able of himself, or not, based on his nature, he's not coercive or something. Or for whatever reason, he can't do it without violating free will in a way that would be unacceptable to effect the salvation of all. Then on the other side, you've got God is surely able, but not willing for some mysterious reason to bring about the salvation of all. And then you can look at a lot of Calvinism and Reformed theology like that, not all of it, because some of it does envision universal salvation. And maybe some of it is just arguably not very different from Arminianism. But then on the bottom of the triangle, you've got universalism that says that God is willing and able, hence all will be saved. And I think that the Arminianism posits this kind of chimera, this completely incoherent and impossible thing of the free and fully informed choice to be forever separated from God, which is final and irrevocable. It's like, to me, one of those adjectives isn't going to isn't going to be there. I can expand on that if you want, but that's my way of saying that I think the real debate is between those who acknowledge that if you're forever separated from God, that's a God thing. That's not a thing that you are able to do of your own.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that was like, so, I mean, wherever that may be, I think it must probably be only in very limited, extreme circumstances. Maybe it's just the devil, or the devil and the Antichrist or whatever, because I lived wrestling within this, because clearly I see these people for whom, and I guess I put myself in this camp, the understanding the Bible through the kind of Calvinist lens, it just makes so much sense. God is revealed to them through that way, where for many others, this free will kind of concept was like the thing that drew them to God. And clearly, in my experience, I say both these people are genuine lovers of God, passionate about the gospel. So I kind of like, okay, well, actually, it makes sense that God would actually not make it either or, but it seems like either or to some people, and it's sort of a both and. So I'm always kind of trying to make a both and instead of an either or when possible.
I can't remember. I like that. I like that. I also like what Ian McGilchrist said, where we need a both and, of both either or and both and. That was actually something I had said verbatim before I heard him say it. I don't remember who it was. Was it C.S. Lewis? I don't think so. But someone said like it's a door that, on the, when you're entering through, above the lintel, says that let whoever will come, something like that. And you go through that door, and on the other side, you look back, it says predestined from all eternity, kind of thing. And now that in and of itself, it may not be a sufficiently specific view to like encapsulate like the kind of Augustinian predestinarianism of Calvinism. That was a lot of isms, but is that a view that you would agree with? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or not necessarily?
Well, I mean, so I'm thinking from the standpoint of if God's in original. So I think that the idea of that there's a new heaven and a new earth and a resurrection, whatever that means, that's the solution that breaks this kind of simulation thing. That's what makes things real, where God can interact with us, not simply within his own mind, I guess. And so if that's his ultimate intention, that's what exists. Whatever exists on the other side of time is what exists. And if he wants to create all the people, if all the people that he creates are people that he wants to be there, that, to me, I think that is possible. But I think, there is this thing of, I think, like, I want people now to be Christians, because I think that knowing Christ in this life is the thing that makes this life better for you and gives it meaning. Like, I don't see what the point, I only think there's Christianity or nihilism ultimately. So,
well, let me challenge you a little bit. Unless in challenging you, I am imputing a view to you that you don't actually hold. But I was watching a video the other day, and it was an atheist who knew a little bit about Reformed theology, and he knew that the person he was disputing was a Calvinist, and so he was being a pain in the ass. But it was fun to watch, because he was like, okay, it's like, you want me to believe? What should I do to believe? It's like, am I able of myself to turn and repent and believe? It's like, according to you, no. What should I do? The poor guy didn't have any answer. You want people to be Christian, but what do you want them to do about it? What is there for them to do?
Well, and I think that there's no doubt about the fact that within this life, not everyone will accept that. So, and when I remember when I was reading, so somewhere I found in my parents' house, they just had bookshelves everywhere, and I picked up this book about tulip, and I'm reading it. And I'm like, wow, you know what? This really makes a lot of sense. And the only one I kind of was like, I don't know about that, was the limited atonement, which I think kind of is one of the big sticking points. Total depravity, I'm like, yes, that makes total sense. And I think that when you see toddlers, honestly, you know,
Vipers and diapers.
well, not, I mean,
Well,
that's just,
I think if we're ever seriously saying that God justly damns unbaptized infants to hell for all eternity, then we've kind of confused God with Molech. I never
yeah.
commanded you
No,
to
I
give your
don't know.
children
And
into the fire. It didn't enter my mind.
no, I do think that, I think that there is some God judging people according to their understanding of what has been revealed to them, so I don't think that whatever, if there's partial punishment or anything after this, I don't think God's doing that to babies. I think that babies who are just going right to be in his presence. That's my belief. And I think that there's enough scriptural evidence to support that, and enough not to have people praising abortion.
You've got very limited time.
Okay.
But yeah, for what it's worth, I do agree with you. Well, where last we left off, I had brought up the debate that I saw between an atheist and a Calvinist, where the atheist said, what exactly are you asking me to do? Because on your own account of things, I can do nothing. So are you just telling me to wait in case maybe he decides to throw me a lifesaver?
Yeah. Well,
But,
and
but you want everyone to be Christian because, as far as you're concerned, it's Christianity or nihilism. The question is, what can they themselves do about that?
well, I mean, I think that so there is this thing like saying, you can get into this philosophical tunnel of just, did I have every choice you've ever made? It feels like you made a choice, but how can you know? You can't go back and make a different choice. So maybe you couldn't make the choice, and so, but for all intents and purposes, we all live as if we have some choice in our actions. And interestingly,
May I just say one thing about that briefly? Because Calvinists always say that, and it gets my goat, because it's like, when you say, well, how is it just for God to damn you for decisions which he, in his meticulous providence, was ultimately, the sovereign power behind? And they say, well, because of compatibilism, just because everything is determined doesn't mean you don't have a kind of free will, for the exercise of which God may justly damn you. It's like, okay, no, but even for the sake of argument, okay, who gets the credit for your good deeds and or your faith and your ability to believe? Well, that's God, because suddenly compatibilism and its whole illustrious philosophical pedigree go right out the window. It's like, what is that? I don't know. It's just, it's just heads I win, tails you lose. It's whatever I need to do in order to make the system work. I don't like it. I'm not a fan.
Well, this is where my kind of idea, that's part of the problem that I think could be solved with this kind of a concept. Because, as I say, for all intents and purposes, it seems that we do have control of our choices. We all live that way. And the Bible clearly holds us responsible for our choices as people who know it and read it and are trying to do God's will. So that's the only way you can live your life. You can't, and this is where I would say my dad would distinguish between that's a Calvinist would live that way, and to act as if you have no choice whatsoever, that makes you a hyper Calvinist. And I even remember one guy who was a pastor, and his son was going to a Christian school, some people I know, and the principal said, like, aren't you like, and his son wasn't serving God or whatever, and the principal said, like, aren't you worried about your son, like that he's not serving God? And the pastor said, maybe my son's not one of the elect. Like, and it's like, wow, that's really
John Piper, he wrote that before his own son Abraham Piper became an apostate. He's, it may be that God has not chosen my sons for his sons.
Yeah. I mean,
No, that's just boy. I mean, like, where do you even start with that? That's just a completely different theology almost, and than I think that Jesus had in mind when he spoke of God as Father. You know,
yeah,
if your child asks you for a gift, will you give him if he asks you for bread, will you give him a scorpion or a stone or something like that? He's like, and you're evil. So how much more will the Father of lights give you a good thing? And so then the question is just, well, he's not the father of all. Um, it says Jesus is the son of, you know, well, I guess it says son of Joseph, who's the son of, so all the way up to Adam, who's the son of who? Son
yeah,
of God.
yeah.
But we're still gonna argue that no, he's not the father of all. Um, I created some for destruction. Or like Mark Driscoll says, God just made some of you to be matchsticks. Sorry.
Yeah.
What do you do about that?
Well, so this is my thinking, because so I would say we have to live as if we do have choice. That's how we all live. That's the right way to live. But clearly, there's some things we don't have choices over. You know, you didn't get to choose your parents. You didn't get to choose where you were born, the century, the place, any of this stuff, and all that stuff has a profound impact on what you can and can't do with whatever choice you do have. Because this is where you get into this problem of all people being free will. Is that how can God do anything except by miraculous interaction, which is him imposing his more powerful will on events? Because, oh, this person was going to be the greatest evangelist of all time, but a drunk driver decided to kill his mom or something, like while he was in the womb. Like that's kind of so God, in his omniscience, has to know some things. And so my kind of conception of this is he's placed all the people where they are throughout history, or whenever he starts it, Adam and Eve, he's looking at all the paths and all the choices and all the things that are going to be, and that's where everybody is. And within each of those people's in their lives, and this is a mind-boggling number of things, because in every second, every person has many choices that they could potentially do. But in our choices, what do? We reject the absurd choices out of hand for the most part. At any minute you could decide, I'm going to drive my car into a wall, but you don't do that.
Well, you notice, with the exception of some weird kind of like appel du vide choices, like maybe I should drive my car into this wall.
Yeah.
For the most part, those choices don't even enter your mind,
Yeah.
right? What if instead of talking to Michael, I did a silly dance?
Right.
It is not something that normally occurs to me
Mhm.
when I'm talking. So that's just interesting how there's some filter that's automatically screening them out.
Yeah. But
Oh, yeah.
I think we're probably all a little timid to admit it, but I'm thankful Jordan Peterson, in his Maps of Meaning, in the introduction, I didn't even get that far, but I did read the introduction. But he talks about this story about how he was like in a class and he had like this impulse to stab the kid in front of him with a pen. And the thing is that, okay, yeah, I've had those weird things too, but I don't take them seriously at all. And that's the thing. So like somehow, like in our brain, we do get these weird notions. So we've imagined it. So it is in a sense possible, and we kind of realize it's possible, but we don't do that. We limit our choices to a smaller range. And yet there are also some things that seems like there are miracles. So there are times when God does do things where, stopping Saul on the road to Damascus, it was God's choice of intervening at that moment because he wanted him to do a different thing. If he had not done that, he would have kept going in the path that he was on. And that was the moment when God decided he needed to intervene to cause a change. And, you could say that about any miracle, big or small. And this was actually a really interesting one. I remember I was reading The Hiding Place, and Corey ten Boom is talking about how she was asking some official who was able to get them ration cards, illegally or whatever. And she said, he asked me how many, and I thought to say 5, but I heard 100 come out of my mouth. And it's like, that wasn't what she wanted to say, but she said that, and that was God's plan for that moment. And that was, so those kind of things are there. And so ultimately, I think in the sense that as a Christian, I believe God does want people to know him here in this life for the good that they do in this world and the things that they accomplish. Some of getting some people to that place happens because of other people not making that choice. So when we look at like people like Richard Dawkins, and he's many people have probably been influenced towards Christianity because of his rejection of Christianity. So there are these sort of things. So so my idea was, and I think we can all probably agree with this, like if after we die in the presence of God, he can show us all of the choices that we did make and the ones that maybe we should have made. And he understands that we did have choices, or we did have potential to do other things in these circumstances. And this particular life that we live, he just created the mix of good choices and bad choices that led to his ultimate will. But potentially, if some of these changes could have been made in a different way, it would have had an effect on certain other people. And so there could be many people who are a Christian because of a few key choices that somebody else made, that if that person had made a different choice, they would not be. And likewise, people who are not Christians who could have become a Christian if certain circumstances worked differently.
May I ask you this?
Yeah.
And I understand if you don't even feel like you have all the knowledge to definitively answer this, and I'm not demanding that you have it. Because, I think we both agreed earlier that no one really has the answers to the kinds of stuff that we're discussing, right? Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're both just speculating and kind of just, getting ahead of our head, the way that my friend Luke likes to say.
Yeah.
We're just kind of exploring possibilities. But I'm going to ask you, do you think that in order for God to save some have to be damned, that we almost need this conceptual complement? Like Wittgenstein's reason for rejecting universal salvation was that if there's a game, it has to be possible to win, which means it should also be possible to lose. If there are winners, there have to be losers. Is there something about creation which is necessarily zero-sum, such that for God to save some requires that you damn some? Would you affirm that, or do you have thoughts on that?
I think that it probably was necessary, maybe in some point, like for a small amount. Like I'd say, maybe if you think about all the people that God imagined creating, he imagines that all of us, because, and I would say this probably is true, all of us do love and appreciate certain aspects of God's character and who he is and the things that are affirmed and upheld in the Bible, but all of us also have certain points at where we reject that, and it is different for very many people. Like, for instance, there's a lot of in kind of like the woke movements and stuff like that, there's this sort of emphasis on we're being compassionate and accepting towards people. That's a godly thing, but you're accepting, you're putting no boundaries on that, and so a wise parent would know that, like, well, you can't do whatever you want, because if you do whatever you want, that's going to hurt somebody else. So
be careful with parental analogies, because you may, in some sense that you don't intend or may pay for later, be acknowledging that God is the parent of that person.
Well, I do think well, this is the point I think I'm trying to make here. I think potentially of all the people God can imagine, they will all accept and reject God in various ways, in the moments and the choices that we make. And perhaps but he must also be able to imagine one being, maybe this is the devil, who literally rejects everything about God all the time.
Right. And that's very interesting, because in regard to this question, it was phrased a little differently. David Bentley Hart and That All Shall Be Saved, which have you heard
I've
of
heard
that
of it,
or
but I
read it?
haven't read it. Yeah.
You should. I don't make book recommendations lightly. In fact, I would be a big hypocrite if I did, because I read very, very little myself. But uh, David Bentley Hart addresses the question of, well, what if someone needs to be in hell, even if it's just one person, like Hitler, as he inevitably gets invoked. The question is, who is your savior in that case? Who really paid the price for your salvation? That's a heretical thought. Don't even entertain it. Like for me, the scripture, it says God is love. 1 John 4:16, hatheos agape estin. David Bentley Hart wouldn't like my pronunciation of that, but whatever. God is love. And the question is, what is love? Love is interesting because do you know Joseph Raisin? Super brilliant gentleman and scholar guy. He also happens to be Jewish, but he's on the Bridges of Meaning Discord, which is mostly Christian, but not exclusively.
Yeah.
He said, I'm going to paraphrase because he always expresses himself much better than I do, but it's like, God is love is idolatry, because love is something finite that exists in creation, and God cannot be identified with that, because for Joseph, the New Testament is not scripture. And so that raises the question, when it says God is love, is it saying, hey, God is this finite thing that you already know all about it? Or is it saying you don't know what love is, and to know what it is, you need to be in relationship with God, because love is ultimately as infinite and ineffable, inexpressible, uncapturable as God.
Mm.
And so that if love is the infinite, or the infinite is love, whichever way it's safer to express that, or maybe one can just say both, then like the infinite, perhaps love has no opposite, no conflict. So the idea that, oh, God, the God who is love, must have some complement in order to define, who does not receive his life. So God is his life, because it says, I am that I am. It says God has life in himself. God is love. It's seeming to say that God is his life, which is love. And that's like saying like the Bodhisattva experiences salvation precisely because of the love that he has for all humankind, that he won't enter nirvana before he liberates, or every sentient creature. And it's not that he's deferring his salvation is already achieved because of that freedom and the joy and the true identity that he has in the love that he bears all humankind, right? So the question is, does the blessedness and the life that God wants to give us through Christ, does that need some complement? Or is love like non-dual and infinite, such that if it has a complement, it merges with it, it dies for it and identifies with it, and transcends even the most ultimate barrier, in order to resurrect and reemerge with more abundant life. I think the Bible seems to be saying the latter. Some people have a dim and dreary vision where, well, what's life? Oh, life is just, having lots of fun and stuff. I get to be with my friends. Not those people. They suck. They have to burn, but what was Jesus talking about in the sheep and the goats? You didn't visit the prisoner. You didn't give to the poor. You imagine your blessedness will be being forever set off from and favored over the imprisoned and the poor in spirit. It's just like, what is this? Is this even the gospel anymore? like but I'm being sharp edged here. Why? Because I didn't sleep very well. Woke up on the wrong side of the bed. And I haven't really thought these things through super well. So like I just express them rhetorically because I don't really know how to like precisely like lay them out logically. But I don't know, just do you have reactions to that? Or just like, you know,
Well, I can see where you're saying how like, oh, that in a sense that would make like the devil the savior in a way. Um, in its necessariness, or necessity. But you know, what I say, some of the stuff is like, I don't know, I don't care. If God can do whatever He wants to do. So if He wants to just save everybody, that's fine. But I think that you have to but just to save everybody then negates what He's revealed to us in the Bible in a sense. If He just if there has to be, or there has to be some reason.
if he waves a magic wand and
Yes,
just
if he
turns
waves,
everybody's will.
yes, if he waves the
But isn't
magic
that what he
wand.
does in Calvinism anyway to the elect?
What?
Isn't that what he does on Calvinism anyway to the elect?
I don't
There's
think so, because
Okay.
it's interesting because in my view, it's very similar actually. Like the way Jacob talks about how the Israel is God's chosen people, and He chose them to suffer. And I think that that's how a good Calvinist, in a sense, should be living their life. It's this choice, like God's chosen you as an instrument to do His will, which means that, yeah, you would expect to be with Him in eternity in the end because you love Him, because you're so grateful for what He's done for you. But it's not like in this life, which is the only one we really know and understand right now. It means God can ask you to do anything, because you're totally.
But this is all acknowledging truly that before you had this life with God, in God, this life of surrender and obedience
Yeah.
and co-suffering with, I would suffer all things for Christ, something like that. My command of scripture is really shaky. I was raised a Hare Krishna. I wasn't raised a Christian at all. Before that, surely you were at enmity with God, right? And then on Calvinism, traditionally, he changes your will for you. He gives you a new heart so you can even ask for a new heart. Absent that, you couldn't. So, but it sounds, don't believe that, or you do, or.
Well, I mean, it's tough for me to say in my own personal experience because I have been a Christian since I was a child. So, and in my sense, it's just this loving view of the world that I was born into, which is very providential. I can't take any credit from that, So, but it very much, the more I have learned about the Bible, the more I've learned about God and Christ, the more it resonates as true with the reality that I experience. So, so I feel fortunate, in a large extent, that even I didn't have to have some traumatic existence prior to coming to that realization.
But weren't you a viper in a diaper before you?
Oh yeah, well, for sure.
That?
I mean, and that's the thing,
So there you go. There you were at enmity with God, weren't you?
Yeah.
But somehow the idea that God may do to everyone what He did to you is not acceptable.
Well, I mean, no. Well, this is kind of the point of my.
I'm being a pain in the ass here.
Yeah,
I recognize.
Well, no, this is the kind of the point of where I was getting at in my little essay that I wrote there, because obviously we can't understand anything without contrast. If God creates the world with the humans that just love Him unconditionally, what is that? It's not. It's like it's just It's just mundane to love God without the contrast of not loving God. So. And I think so we have to look at these experiences, there has to be some way of repentance, a changing of mind, coming to a new understanding. I tend to give God a lot more credit than I want to give ourselves for that, because and the thing is that
and are you that there are just going to be some who will never go through that process of repentance?
potentially.
Potentially.
Well, so, and this is the thing. So I think there are many, kind of models or people, and I think this is somewhat of an orthodox idea that those, who are in Christ will be resurrected, and, then others will suffer. And then after the suffering, then they will also be, saved, essentially. So a post-death period of punishment, but ultimately,
It kind of sounds like that's what happens to people in this life before they're saved.
yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, if
It
you're,
sounds like the same thing. In other
Yeah,
words, you were dead in your sins,
yeah,
and then you repented and you turned to God. Now, Calvinism is going to say the only reason he did that is because God decided to unilaterally reach in and bring about that change for you. And some other people, like the Arminians, are going to say you did that of your own free will. Probably the real truth is something like those MC Escher hands,
yeah,
where, in other words, you don't understand the law without the instance, and you don't understand the instance without the law. If that makes any sense, the part and the whole, they interdepend. And in that moment, there's an interdependency between God and creatures, such that God is not a father without he's not a creator without his creatures. He's not a father without his just analytically. So, I'm kind of willing to be with the Calvinists there and say that actually that's not wholly of your own doing. Or at least I would understand that this whole free will business, you don't have this radically independent free will that subsists outside of God. I don't think you have that. And so I'm not trying to lambaste the idea that God would reach in and change your heart as some totally ridiculous, unfair idea. C.S. Lewis, and I feel that somewhat in my own experience. I don't feel like I can be rightly related to God, like, dispositionally, without his grace.
mm-hmm.
I think he has to give me that grace for me to even almost ask for grace in the right spirit. So yeah, I'm not trying to totally deride that idea. I am more skeptical of the idea that God could not do that for everyone and will not. But you see, I just want to make my views clear here.
Yeah. So, and I think this is kind of where I was coming at. So, for some people maybe would say they're living their whole life rejecting God. They're hearing about all their life. They have no desire to know about it. Whereas, yeah. Whereas others, you want to say hi? Hi. Say hi.
Now there's this thought that you keep trying to, I keep interrupting you. You keep trying to, get back on that track, and then there's all these other interruptions.
Yeah.
So if you can remember, talking about, yeah.
So essentially, we have to understand, like, whatever choices we've made, you can imagine, or God can imagine, what would have happened if you had made the other choices. And I think this is where I kind of talked a little bit about how, there's been a lot of, like, science fiction movies that have talked about this idea of, like, what if somebody goes back in time and changes something, and then there's various views of, well, like, in the time machine, it's like whatever he's always trying to go back in time to save his fiance or whatever, but everything he changes, something else causes her to die, because, like, that was a fixed thing that can't be changed. Whereas other, like Back to the Future, they go back in time, they make a different decision, and it creates an alternate timeline. And so I think but that's completely separate. It's completely separate from our timeline. And in that one, they're able to resolve it, but sometimes it's like, no, now you're just living in another timeline. It's interesting because in science fiction, they really do kind of flesh out a lot of these sort of what ifs in interesting ways. But I think we
Are
have
you
to assume.
suggesting that in the future might be such that some eventualities are fixed, but not all? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I think that what is fixed is that whatever is in the new heaven and the new earth and all that entails, I think that's fixed, because I think that is what God's original point of creation is. And what we are existing in now, in a sense, is working through the prototype. But there might have been many prototypes, because for all of these different points in history, and since God's infinite and unlimited, it could be down to every choice you make of, what you order for lunch, or what, just the most mundane choices. God can imagine all of them. And so the amount of potential, parallel worlds is, in a sense, it's almost limitless, because I'm saying he does, I think, rejects out of hand the absurd ones, like ones where no people exist, because that seems to be the goal of this endeavor. So that's where I think it diverges from kind of the science fiction models, ultimately, because
it may be that there's an infinite number of possibilities, even barring some. So have an infinite set that is properly infinite, but it's only whole numbers. So not every. So that's a big fallacy that people commit when they talk about the kind of many worlds, and that if there's an infinite number of universes, which is kind of silly, because universe should already properly be singulars, because they talk about the multiverse, and the multiverse becomes what was originally meant by universe. But if there's an infinite number of worlds, that means every possibility is realized. It does not. Any more than there being an infinite set of numbers means that every number is represented within that set. There are going to be numbers which are not in the infinite set of whole numbers. So it could still be limitless, even if it's not containing everything.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, excuse me, it could still be infinite in some quasi-numerical sense, despite not embracing every possibility.
Yeah, I think that sums up my thinking in a sense. So all of there's an infinite number of ways that this world could be created. That doesn't require a bunch of weird, absurd, universes where everybody is bugs or something like that. So within the choices of what God desired to create, he did imagine all the potentials.
Well, the only thing is that it's not clear that if the potentials are infinite, that he imagined all of them. That would be a sort of actualized infinity type of deal, and an actualized infinity, it's an interesting idea. It's almost like you could count to the last number in an infinite series. There's something about the notion of totality which is exhaustive, but one can never, by definition, exhaust infinity. God cannot create square circles, or can he? What do you think? Can God himself exhaust infinity? Or is it simply that the number of possibilities is not infinite? Which brings us back to my first question. He fashioned the possibilities, a finite number of them, but out of what more fundamental possibility or potentiality did he fashion the possibilities themselves?
Well, so I'm going to say, when we get to the sort of outer limits of this kind of conceptual thinking, it's not necessarily as interesting to me. Or what I would say is that I'm gonna say this, like, this is the central reality, or it seems that way, at least to us being in it. But like the world where everything is exactly the same, except one day in your life you ate a different lunch, is almost exactly the same as this reality, but very slightly different. And the more those changes occur, along all the people that have ever been created a long time, the more different they are. And this also changes over the course of history as we understand it. So our choices, we don't know how much future is left, but our choices are never going to be as impactful as our grandfathers or great grandfathers, et cetera, which makes sense in a way because Adam and Eve had the most profound impact through whatever they chose, because their choice affected literally everyone that came after them, whereas my choices only really affect whoever comes after me, and that's a much smaller amount of people. So the possibilities for my choices are less. There's also more people as time goes on, population increases. So if you were trying to like work this out on a computer, it would be impossible probably. But
it may be that your own choices ultimately create as many ripples as Adam's and Eve's did. Whoever exactly they were they Homo erectus and Australopithecus afarensis, respectively? Were they loose? Was Eve Lucy or something like that? Or that whole question. But the Earth is 6,000 years old, and Noah's Ark contained every species on it, and the dinosaurs ate watermelons in the Garden of Eden where there was yet no death. But the dinosaurs existed at the same time as human beings, or something like that. But I'm questioning whether you have as little power as you think. But anyway, it may be that your choices ripple out in eternity in a very consequential way. Just as much as theirs do. I'm not sure.
So I guess
I can riff here a little more, but
well, I think the kind of question is trying to figure out is like, if something is imagined by God, like we kind of differentiate between like real and imaginary in a sense. And the things, but then, there's some things that we imagine, if you imagine realistic things that you might actually do today.
Right. But I think what you're getting at is, for God, what he imagines is real, is what we experience as reality, correct? Yes, but the imagined is still set against some backdrop or complement of what is not imagined, right? In order for it to have meaning.
Yeah, or I'm saying is maybe like, so before you do anything, you're imagining what you're going to do, and then, but you always end up imagining more than exactly what you do. Like even like coming into a conversation like this, maybe we have certain ideas about like, I'm going to talk about this thing and that thing, but now I'm interacting with you and you say something that throws in a different direction. So it will go.
Which is another way of saying that in a sense you imagined less than what actually happened.
I don't know. Well, let me see. Let me go through with another.
I mean, both can be true.
Yeah.
It seems to me that very often it's like I imagined one thing. What happened was not one thing; it was a million things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think of another analogy, like if you were like drawing a picture or something, you start with a blank page, you can imagine any drawing you want, and you may actually imagine a specific image in your mind, but maybe you have a limitation, depending on how good you are at drawing, of how well you could represent that on the page. And at some point within the process, maybe you realize that early on, because you've already drawn some lines, and those lines are not exactly how you imagine them. And then you start, but that part that's already on the page is there. So now you have to change your imagined drawing to correspond with the part of it that's on the page, and then the imagined part changes to fit along with it. And as the drawing is completed, the amount of differences that you can imagine are less and less, until you get to the part where, oh, well, I can, just close this little line here, and that's it. That was your last little choice, you know? So, but in that scenario, here's the absurd thing of like, anything that's not drawing a picture, because that was the goal that you set, was to draw a picture. I mean, you could say maybe you decide to tear it up and throw it away because it didn't come out the way you want, you know? So, however it's God, you know, we're here as a product because of God's imagining. And you know, in this way, maybe, you know, a simulation is a good analogy, because in a simulation you're setting parameters, but you're giving all of those parameters, which would be the people or whatever, some amount of control that is not specified. So, and then you play it out, and that could play out a lot of different ways, but you know, not everything is possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly for freedom, you know, to be possible, there has also to be constraint. I think that there's freedom is always defined within some kind of larger matrix of constraints. I think that's very wise. I think that's true. I think even creative project is defined within the larger matrix of the constraints of his logically necessary nature, being an uncreated mind. God is only defined or limited by what is logically necessary about his nature. Whereas you and I, there are things about us that could be otherwise, logically or conceptually, imaginatively, and yet they are the way they are, because we don't exist by logical necessity. We exist in a more contingent way. And so, you know, who and what we are is defined by what gave rise to us, and what gave rise to us in turn is defined by, you know, the larger matrix of constraints within which it was shaped. But God, you know, outside him there is no other, and there's no more ultimate reality than ultimate reality. So not even fully cognizant of where I was going with that, but I was agreeing with your point about this kind of dynamic, or this interplay between freedom and constraint. Again, all my thinking here is heavily influenced by Christopher Langan, to whom I owe a great deal, in terms, because before I read him, I was just some kind of garden variety atheist, sort of a Richard Dawkins type of guy, not quite so unsophisticated, maybe, but not very sophisticated. Arguably, I'm not very sophisticated now. I'm not a professional philosopher by any means. Nor do I know my Bible that well. But anyway, yeah, no, I mean, there's certainly mysteries here. You know, you're just talking about, you know, the outer limits of this kind of conceptual thinking. It's like, you know, nobody can know those limits. To know the limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit, as Hegel put it. I conceive ultimate reality as a self-resolving paradox, again, to borrow that phrase from Langan, which is always, it is always its own limit, and then it's always transcending that limit. It is its own complement, and then it merges with its complement through a kind of death, agapic death and resurrection. But you know, that's about as far as I can go in terms of the limits of my own conceptual thinking.
Well, so okay, I'm going to try to cover some of the other points in my thinking to tie things together a little bit more. So my thought was God wants to create the more permanent reality that we would consider to be the new heavens and the new earth, and that, is a place with many, many people in it. And one of the necessary things of that, I believe, is the incarnation, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. And so maybe God's imagining other realities, but the ones where he imagines that not happening, it doesn't lead to his ultimate goal. So those are the ones that's the line that makes it purely imaginary, because it doesn't, without that act, it doesn't end in the place that he desires. But with that being present in every possible universe, the act of Christ, which is before the foundations of the earth, that the Lamb is slain, and that Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That those events of his life here on earth are, in a sense, eternal events. So in every possible simulation, that was always one of the ingredients. That was always there. But then within that, maybe there, let's say, just to use smaller numbers or whatever, let's say God runs the simulation 100 times. And in one scenario, and he picks the one where the most people serve him and love him. But in some of these other ones, because of different choices different people make, it's a different set of people. So some people who are in on scenario A or whatever are out on scenario B, and some of the people who are out on scenario B are in on scenario A. So you know what I'm saying here. Like, so in this one,
is it axiomatic, or is it possible? Is it axiomatic that there is no world in which everyone is in, or does that remain a possibility?
Well, I think that well, this is what I'm saying here. There's one new heaven and new earth, but maybe there is multiple of whatever this earth and this reality is. Because so we can easily imagine the sense of, let's say, somebody decides to reject God because like a minister or a priest or something did something that turned them off from Christianity. That's a very common story.
I'm sorry. Let me just try to clarify for my own understanding, because is the question that I asked, was it basically a bad question? It was framed as a yes or no. Are you saying it doesn't admit of a simple yes or no?
Well, I mean, what was the question again?
The question is, because you are saying, I am gathering this from you, that there's a new heavens and a new earth, and that's kind of fixed. But the routes there,
yeah,
there are a number of different possible routes.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is, is it possible that, because you said in some of the routes there, some people are in and others are out, and then on a different route, some of the last will be first and vice versa. So some of the reprobate in world A are the elect in world B, and so on. What I'm asking is, in your thinking, is it possible that the new heaven and the new earth could have everyone, or is it somehow axiomatic that whatever route one takes, there's going to be some winners and some losers? That's what I've been asking. It's kind of a yes, no, but it may be that, as far as you're concerned, the question is a bad question. It doesn't admit of a yes.
Oh, okay. No. Okay. So I will say this is the conception of how to resolve the problem. How could it contain everyone? So that is what I'm saying. Yes. In the new heaven and the new earth, it contains everyone. And so I was thinking about this from the. Yeah. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, and you said that before. I just haven't been listening terribly well, but
Okay.
you did say that you're trying to explain how it
Yeah.
is on your kind
So
of
okay, so
modalistic
like
view.
because here's the thing, like I remember hearing something of this is like because this is I remember this kind of set me off on this line of thinking. I remember I was listening. I was driving a car that I don't usually drive, so I was listening to the radio because it didn't have the thing where I would normally plug my phone in, and I just happened to be listening to some Christian preacher on the radio, and somebody called into this show and was asking like, will I remember my loved ones that didn't love Jesus in heaven, and this preacher was saying, no, like God's going to wipe away every tear. You're not even going to remember that they existed. And
The
I was
eternal
like,
sunshine of
well,
the spotless memory.
yeah. So I was like, what? I don't know. That does not seem like good. Like, that just seems like a weak, patching of a hole in your theological framework there to just give an answer like that. And so
I
I
mean,
was kind of
if you were in heaven, but the condition was you could have no memory of your daughter, who would you even be? In
yeah.
David Bentley Hart's terms, you wouldn't be Michael. You would be some anonymized essence.
Mhm.
Whatever was there would, it wouldn't share the same solar essence as you, because in your essence, in your soul, you are crucially defined by your fatherhood of your daughter. And that's a very, very serious theological assertion to say that you just won't remember him. My sons, maybe you didn't choose for his sons, but when I get there, it's going to be the eternal perfection of dementia.
Yeah. So then I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about and a good example was when Jordan Peterson interviewed that the Native First Nations Canadian artist, and he told his experience that he had gone to this residential school run by the Catholic Church, and he was horribly abused, sexually abused as a small child. He caused all this confusion, terrible, terrible things. We hear these stories happen, and he said, I want no part of their Bible. I don't want anything to do with their Jesus. And so it's very easy, and so to say like, well, because he rejected Jesus, he's going to hell. That's terrible, and I don't think that's true. It's very easy to conceive of that on the other side of eternity, he understands, God says what they did was wrong. Your understanding that good parents and good teachers should not do that to children, that's because you do understand and reflect my love, so that Christ is in him. Christ was in his grandfather who took care of him, but it was framed through this framework of a Native American or Native Canadian religion that didn't have Jesus Christ. It didn't have those elements. Now, we would say that in my conception, what would make that possible is that what Christ did, and he could understand that after he died. But or even, and that's kind of an extreme example, because the chance of, but or just to have some imaginary loved one who, for whatever reason, heard about God and rejected it. And a lot of times these people are not rejecting, but saying, no, I reject this because I want to be a selfish humanist and do everything that I want for my own pleasure. Like that kind of cartoon character of the evil rejection of God very rarely exists. Most
and see, the thing is, one can't. God is the highest good, let's say, in some objective or transcendent or ultimate sense, such that he is the highest good, whether you realize it or not. Which means that if you could really see him in his perfection for who he is, you wouldn't reject him. So it follows that every God that you reject is a false God and an incomplete understanding. And that's why I said at the outset that whether you're eternally separated from him is not a thing which it is in your power to effect. That's a God thing. That's not a you thing. So that's why I said it really is universalism or Calvinism, because every God that you reject is a false God. It is not, no man has seen God at any time. It's not the true God.
So this is where it gets to a weird point in my conception. So let's imagine, so we can clearly imagine that God can show how anyone was mistaken and how they were not in fact rejecting Christianity, but they were rejecting some sinful, unchrist-like thing about what they were being presented. In fact, like, from what I understand, there's a lot of people who simply reject Christianity because of the concept of God sending people to hell. And they say, oh, well, if God didn't do that, then I would be willing to listen to you talk about it. So, that's a very, strange sort of scenario. But so we can easily imagine that God could correct our faulty knowledge and show us the true understanding of what's real. But how would he do that? And I think potentially one way is that he could show us a version of our life or whatever where we made different choices. But potentially he could also conceivably show us a different version of our life where other people made different choices. And if somebody is not a Christian because of somebody else's choices, because of abuse or just misrepresentation or something like that, then if we imagine another world where those choices didn't happen, and so then that person has a clear path to hearing and acknowledging and understanding that God loves them. When you get to heaven or whatever, if you have a loved one that rejected God and then they're there, is it because God showed them why they were wrong? Or is that person, in fact, your loved one from another world where different choices were made and put them on a different path? That's kind of my weird kind of a conception of it. And in some ways it's like, because if one person did one thing different, and that means somebody would love God that otherwise doesn't, like, then God's hand tied in a sense from saving that person because of this other person's choice. If you want to take the conventional kind of thinking about why some people are saved and others are not saved, so that was like my kind of conception is, how real or not real are these other worlds? Like, is there a world where Richard Dawkins is a Christian? Like, and maybe there is, but because Richard Dawkins isn't a famous atheist, there's actually less people that know about God in that world or something.
Well, I mean, my own rather simplistic and straightforward way of looking at it is that if there's a multiverse of possible worlds, that multiverse is the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And all those denizens of the different timelines, if such they may be called, are really just numerically distinct individuals. And it's God's choice again whether he wants to reap the harvest of all or whether he wants to lose some in the eternal trash fire. What I'm saying, in other words, I tend to think that the me from some other timeline, except I was born in Finland or something, is not even really me. I'm sort of with the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset when he said that I am I and my circumstances.
Yeah. Well, but that's what I was saying. Like, the you that was born in Finland, that's a different thing, because being born in Finland is something you have no control over.
Well, it's also like what Saul Kripke said. I think maybe this is the second time I'm quoting him, but he said, not that I'm a great reader of Kripke or anyone, but he said that the essence of an individual is its origin, which is quite interesting, because it's raising the question of whether my parents would have to be in Finland. I mean, presumably, yes, for me to be born to them in Finland. But would that anyway? I'm sorry, this is a speculation that might be irrelevant, but I tend to see that multiversal denizen as a numerically distinct individual for myself, for whom the same question really just applies just as much as it would for a twin of myself that I have here in this world, hypothetically, even though the reification of possible worlds, on this conceptual framework requires me not to be speaking of this world, but of some other. But if we take the possible world where I had a twin, the same question would stand. Is he saved or is he not? And does God want us both or just the one? That's the simple level that I'm operating on.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe I would say whatever you are as a you, like there's probably not multiples of you, because like let's say whatever that means, there's just one you. But if God in his omniscience can show you everything about the choices that you did make and the impact that they had, because I know I've certainly made choices that I would say I've done something sinful, and that's not, God could show me in a sense why it would have been better for me potentially to have not done that, but also why his overall plan is better because I did do that, or how he was able to use that in a way that was beneficial to his overall plan. You know what I'm saying?
You meant it for evil, but he meant it for good.
Yes.
Or in the Silmarillion, when Morgoth starts playing his own melody, God directs the orchestra around him and somehow arrives at music which is just as beautiful, if not more, than what it would have been had Morgoth not decided to take center stage.
Yeah. So I mean,
in other
I think
words,
that
the devil competes with God, but God has no competition.
Yeah, and I mean that's why I think, in a sense, whether God, this is my thing, was that the ultimate, in the eternal conscious torment, in a sense, exists in the mind of God, because he's aware of every pain that we've ever experienced, that we've inflicted on others. He's eternally conscious of his paying for that through the crucifixion, and all of the pain of creation, all the bad stuff that exists in the world now, where people will say, like, if God's so good, why did he make this like this? Well, in the end, in the final summation of things, he's going to remember all that stuff and you won't, as far as like the pain, or he may, however much of that he may let us remember to contrast his goodness, is up to him. But
or maybe you'll remember all of it, but it won't have any sting anymore.
Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying, because we do understand like how
because it will have been redeemed,
and the revelation of knowledge of how our, not only our sufferings, but also the evil that we do, can bring glory to him. It's not, and that's why I think, in a sense, there might be two things that God may want to show you. He may want to show you, in one instance, the life that you could have lived, where you perfectly embodied Christ in every choice you made. And that would be for your own understanding, to understand how much greater you could have been in your life of service towards him. But in the other hand, show you how he has redeemed every bad choice that you made and every bad thing that happened to you. And maybe it's not all of it, maybe it's some percentage of it that he reveals to you. So, because I think we do kind of all have this understanding that we're, this is what Paul says, now we understand in part, but then, we'll understand in full. So there will be some sort of revelation of knowledge about what's going on here that we will get after this time. So, I mean, and I think those are two ways. And I think in one way, God could imagine, in a sense, a world where every single person was a Christ figure, sinless, in a sense, perfectly embodying his love in all that they did. But maybe in the net, the whole world, that would not be if there was a world where one person was perfectly sinless, I'm saying like now, today or something, they might just get killed because for whatever reason they would come off as, they would reveal in others the sinful nature that they don't like, and it would cause resentment, and they would probably get murdered or something like that. So yeah, it's hard. I wrote a little bit about that in my essay, that there's an imaginary potential of all of our choices, because we could also imagine a world where we gave into the most selfish desire all the time. Eventually, like, we could all be Christ, we could all be psychopaths, we could all, that possibility sort of exists. And really what keeps it from being one or the other is the stuff that we don't have control of, mainly our interactions with others, and the circumstances that we live in. And so we are, in a sense, all threads woven together in a pattern that works towards God's ultimate goal. But my kind of question is if there's some threads that are discarded in this pattern, maybe there's another pattern where they are the ones that are redeemed.
Or you look at it this way too. There's one way to purge the cosmos of evil is to get rid of all the evildoers. Although one questions how many would be left. The other is to just get rid of all the evil in each evildoer. So in other words, to remove a thread from the tapestry is not necessarily synonymous with deracinating an entire person and the whole web of relationships that he or she represents and is defined by.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's sort of
we have 1 minute left, and I'm wondering if we could potentially end on this note or a similar one, and leave the rest for a part 2.
Yeah, that's fine. You're saying part 2 today, or
I'm sorry, no, part 2 maybe next week or
okay,
something.
yeah, that's fine.
Some things I probably need to be getting at today, but I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
I mean, it's like you said, what we've been talking about, it's really actually mind-blowing. Like, you can't really understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But I should go back and listen to your original video about the imagination and possibilities and so on. Although I think I did get a good understanding of what you were trying to say in that, just from this conversation. So
Okay.
yeah, let's pick it up in another conversation.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.